Healer trinketed. 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 Healer trinketed.
I've managed to unravel most of his wards, but Bellavere was always extravagant with his safeguards. I will need your help for this last one.
We build our future upon the backbone of tradition. The eternal sun still guides us. The Sunwell must be protected. Do not squander resources. What would you ask of me for Quell Thalas? not squander resources. I am rather busy. Do not let outsiders interfere.
Baladash, Malinore. We embrace power. We do not fear it. Come with an open mind. How many times must Darkhan's crimes haunt us? Be on your guard, champion. I sense something.
Today, we are discussing this witchcraft, which can make you gain upwards of 30 to 50 extra FPS even on your potato machine, which doesn't actually have to do with any of these tricks and secrets about your graphic settings. You know, here's a guide on how to perfectly set your video settings to gain FPS? Here is the updated drivers for your GPU. How about tinkering with your OS to get more power on your graphics card, and all these things you try to do to gain more FPS on your game? But this is actually something different, because as this tech has been circulated for a while now, you could be gaining a lot of extra FPS by actually tinkering with something else, which is your sound settings, not your video settings. This will come at a downside, of course. It will be up to you to decide how big of a downside this is. Now, without getting too much into the nerdy, which many players won't care about, WoW for a long time has been a single core CPU game. Then it was expanded finally to be a multi-threaded kind of game. But there are a few things that still remain bound to be single core processed, like your UI and your Lua coding cannot be multi-threaded, which is why WoW, as it is right now, will always be CPU bound. No matter how efficient Blizzard tries to be with graphic settings and computing effects, combat events will need to be resolved by the UI frame by frame still on just one core. Now, what's the issue here? The issue is that part of this processing on one core in combat events also comes with your sounds, because you're not just mashing buttons and you have to compute all of these abilities you're clicking, but also the sound that comes with those abilities. This is perhaps a trick other players enjoying other games might have discovered a while ago when they were trying to fix this very same problem to increase their FPS. For example, they went for this while playing Path of Exile. For basically the same reason. There is about 64 million sounds happening at the same time, and you're getting FPS drops. And then suddenly you fix this little thing and your FPS issues go down by a lot. Now, the issues with your sound in-game come from a couple of things, but there is one in particular. So, the couple of things extra which follow this same path but are not nearly as impactful are things like enabling a reverb or enabling distance filtering, which can also lower your performance. But the biggest issue and the biggest gain to your FPS in these situations would be the audio channels. Now, the audio channels very simply means is when you play the game, you have that many channels to fill in everything that's happening. And also, everything that's happening doesn't have just a single sound source. Sometimes certain abilities, for example, maybe Pyroblast or maybe things like Chaos Bolt, will have one sound for the cast, the channeling of the cast, one sound for the finishing of the cast when you're creating the Pyroblast, and then one sound for the traveling of the Pyroblast, and then one sound for the landing of the Pyroblast. Things might also get more complicated, of course, when you take into account that your specs have tons of things happening at the same time. For example, as a balanced druid, you might open up with Eclipse and get your sounds off from Eclipse, but as you open up with Eclipse, you also have your Apex talent, which has an additional sound. At the same time, Shooting Stars was also active, which is an extra set of sound effects. And then if you're proccing Orbit Breaker, you are dropping down a full moon, which is another sound effect. And as you are doing your normal rotation, maybe right after entering Eclipse, with your first Star Surge, you proc Star Weaver, which is another extra sound effect warning for your proc. And all of these will be slotted into different sound channels, depending on how many sound effects they have for each of these effects. So the amount of sound channels you want in game is essentially how many of these channels do you want to have available for all of your sound effects to go into. Now, when you are at 128, it means almost certainly you will be able to slot all of the sounds in all of these different channels. But what happens if you go down to 20, for example? Here already, for example, we had at this point, for example, we had 15 channels completely occupied. But imagine you're not just hitting a dummy, you're actually in a raid. There is 19 more players, there is potential sound coming from other players in the raid. Imagine, for example, the sounds of things like Bloodlust, or the sound of things of other abilities, big effects that come even through your sound effects coming from other players. And then there is also the boss effects, the boss abilities, the boss mechanics. And then there is also the warnings of DBM. Maybe you're playing with Northern Sky raid tools, that's also sound effects. Also, you are a healer or even a DPS, you have a note, you have a timer which tells you to use defensives, personals, hellstones and whatnot. That's another channel for sound that needs to be filled. But if you have scaled down to only having 20 channels and these 15 at this moment are already occupied, you only have 5 sound channels left. The result of this is that when you scale down the channels, you significantly reduce the computing power from your poorly abused and overused single core to process all of the sounds coming from these channels, at the downside of simply cutting off some of the sounds. Because once you reach 20 channels occupied, the 21st sound in your game will just not come, will just be muted, because it just won't have a channel to go into. But the positive side is that it won't have to be processed. You won't actually have to hear it. Players, of course, by the way, who play completely muted and blast some music in the background will have noticed none of this, because they had the sound muted, so they were already playing at full effectiveness already. But if you were playing with sound, if you want to hear your warnings, for example, whether they are from a boss mod or from Northern Sky or even from your own mechanic, right? You want to be made aware that you have a proc effect and whatnot, and you were playing with that, you were having and you are still having your FPS, your smoothness in game lowered down by just how many sound channels you have available. Now, unfortunately, a small indie company, small tiny game with a low budget, we still don't have in the game any kind of these two things. Number one, sound priorities. There is no priority in Blizzard in terms of sound effects, which, for example, makes Blizzard say, okay, let's make sure, for example, that boss mechanics are always the highest in priority for sound channels, or even boss warnings from add-ons, or even boss warnings from Blizzard's own timeline, if you want to put a sound on that, have a higher priority. So you enter a situation, for example, where if you're fighting Lura and the glaive mechanic is about to come, right, and you have a boss warning or a Northern Sky warning for glaives, you will be able to have a priority system where if the glaive warning would have to start here, but your sound channels were full, the Blizzard game would say, okay, we don't care about the sound effect of Eclipse, Eclipse goes away. So we make space for the glaive sound, so you always get to hear a boss mechanic sound because it has a higher priority. We actually don't have that in game. So what's going to happen is this is going to try to come in, it will find all of the sound channels filled, and you just won't get the sound of the glaives. The only limited priority system Blizzard has is that it does have a divided set of sounds for the dialogue, which is not going to get cut off from sound effects. It's going to be its own different thing. Both the dialogue and the music and the ambience are not part of this. We're talking about the sound effects in game. There used to be one solution to this a while ago, the classic Ctrl-S, which allows you to disable the sound effects, which used to work with mods, all mods, so you were able to mute the sounds from the game, just from the game, but keep basically the other sounds you could have gotten yourself from add-ons. So at this point, the question is, okay, I want to try to gain more FPS and I want to lower my channels, but how much is too much? Because it could also become grating to hear or somewhat, distracting to hear when you go down to 20 channels and you start hearing the countdown, 5, 4, and then it stops because it just got overwritten by some other sounds. Or you go through a boss fight where you're expecting the beam cast of the boss to get the announcement, to get the warning on its 10 casts, but you're only gonna hear it 4 times because the other 6 times it got cut off. And at different points of the fight too. Sometimes you're gonna hear the beam warning on the first and second cast, and then on the last 2 casts. Sometimes you won't hear any beam warning for the first 5 casts, and then you will hear it for the 6th, 7th, 8th, and 9th cast. It's also completely random, based on which other sounds you're just sending through at that moment. Now the safest one to cut from 128 would be 64. This one, most of the time, won't even cut any sound effects, or the major ones you want to hear anyways. You won't notice that many things are being cut off while still limiting the amount of sound channels by half. This is likely the better result. If you want to go even further down, 32 would be the other option. This is where you will get a few of the sounds to be cut off, so it can be more noticeable, but same will also be the smoothness in gameplay for most players who were having some FPS problems to begin with. If you are one of those players who was having that, like 20, 30, FPS in combat, meaning that your GPU, and more importantly being that this is WoW, your CPU was struggling in combat with that many players, with that many things to process, then cutting down the sound channels will be noticeable. Now, if you want to try this out, because this doesn't really hurt at all, if you
Healer trinketed.
The Sunwell must be protected. It would be unwise to oppose us.
Your efforts against the recent void and ethereal incursions have paid off. It's time we take the fight to them.